Welcome everyone to class. We are starting a new chapter today, the political system under strain at home and abroad. And as I was saying earlier, this chapter's title is ridiculous, okay? It's just ridiculous. It's a terrible title of a chapter, okay? And I know this is kind of like a rant that I've had more than once, but the chapter titles in this book are just, like, I don't know. They were trying to be so clever that they forgot to be clever. It's not clever. It's wordy, it's awful, it's obtuse. No one knows what you're talking about, okay? This is populism and imperialism. That's what every normal historian says about it, okay? You know, there's sometimes when like you just want to be different because you want to be different and you feel like you're a super special snowflake. No one else is like you because you have the best chapter titles ever. Well, no, okay? Clarity. That's what we need. All right. Anyways, moving on. This chapter is about the political stuff going on towards the turn of the century. Okay? So they're really squeezing every last drop out of the Gilded Age that they can. Okay? This chapter covers the political stuff going on. And we talked a little bit about political machines last week. And we talked about, you know, kind of like charity work. And we talked a little bit about the way the government operated. And really, that's because most of the government, and like we can talk about 5 presidents on one slide, because during this time period, the government is what we call laissez-faire. The government's attitude toward the economy, the government's attitude towards most things is laissez-faire. Does anyone remember what laissez-faire means?
Oh, release, hands off.
Hands off. The government is French for hands off. The government is hands off in its management of the economy. Okay, it's hands off in its management of a lot of things. To put it simply, the federal government is very small, as the founding fathers kind of intended. If you remember when we talked about the Constitution, it was a big deal just to have a federal government. When we were talking about ratifying the Constitution, the anti-federalists were scared of the idea of a federal government. They thought that a federal government could be a threat to liberty in and of itself, that the best and only government should be local or at the very most state level government. And that the federal government really only needed to exist to like have a national army in case of a war and to regulate trade a little bit. But over the course of American history, slowly by slowly, the federal government has grown in power. And as the federal government has grown in power, the president has grown in power as well. One of the first presidents to really push the growth of federal power was probably Andrew Jackson. And we talk about how he was willing to do things as a president that increased the power of his government as a president, but the federal government itself still wasn't very strong. The next major president that really expanded federal power was Abraham Lincoln. But that happened largely as a result of literally the Civil War. In order to win the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln expanded the role of the federal government and expanded the powers of the presidency. But once that ended, he was followed up by a really awful president, Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson, he was such a bad president that Congress actually voted to reduce his powers to the point where it was even constitutionally suspect whether or not, you know, Congress could do some of the things they did to Andrew Johnson. And after Reconstruction, we have 5 presidents in a row that are not very strong, okay? But that's by design. Look at the Constitution. Almost all the power of government belongs to Congress. And Congress is the dominant force in politics during the Gilded Age, which allows for big business to be the dominant force in politics. I'm going to teach you a quick political lesson. You know what every politician wants? The number one thing every politician wants, more than anything else. You got to guess?
Money and power.
Sort of. They want to be reelected. Politician always wants to be reelected. We don't have term limits in Congress. We have term limits now for the president, but we didn't even have term limits back then. Presidents just usually retired after 8 years because they were either tired of it or they couldn't get reelected again, or they thought, well, George Washington wouldn't run more than twice, so I won't either. Okay. anyways, but for Congress, they'll run forever. There are people that spend 20, 30, 40 years in Congress. Okay, just get reelected, reelected, reelected. How do you stay reelected? Well, you keep people happy and you get money for your part of the country. Okay, they called it pork barrel spending. Okay, where, you know, if you're a politician and you're passing a law, you're going to make sure that your slice of the country gets a piece of the pie. Okay, laws are weird things. You can have a law that says an immigration act, but that law about immigration could have an amendment or a rider on the bill that's something about, oh, we're going to build a bridge in Saskatchewan, New York. We'll appropriate $30,000 to build a bridge in, you know, St. Louis. And it's like, why is that in that law? Well, because sometimes that's how you get laws passed. Okay, someone in Congress is trying to pass a law and they need so many votes. And there's the representative that represents St. Louis, and he says, I'll vote for it, but only if you give me a bridge. And so they say, fine, we'll give you a bridge. And they put that in, okay? And that's how they do things. And then whenever it's time for Mr. St. Louis representative to run for re-election, he says, hey guys, remember this bridge that I got us? Vote for me again, I'll get us more goodies, okay? And the same thing happens today. Not to get political, but if you just look at the most recent stimulus bills. It's not just about giving people a $1,400 check, okay? When they're spending that much money, you go look at where the money's going. And every person in Congress is like putting in their little wish list. And there's all these little pork things that go in to making sure that all these different people get money and get spending. And that's how you have trillions of dollars of debt, is that you start spending all this money out the wazoo. And so there's little things that they sneak into these 1,000-page long bills that get people money, and it's corrupt, okay? Big business will donate money to politicians to help them get reelected, especially during the Gilded Age, and then in return, they make sure that laws are favorable to the businesses and things of their districts or their states. And through that system, we have an incredibly corrupt federal government and an incredibly corrupt state and local governments across the country. Okay, because everybody's trying to use the money to enrich themselves or to stay reelected or to help out a big business. And the presidents really can't do much about it, or they're in the thick of it themselves. Okay, so we have some pretty boring presidents. Okay, we have Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland, Chester Arthur, James Garfield, and Rutherford B. Hayes. Okay, now these are some very bearded presidents. They got some beards, okay? Abraham Lincoln was the first president with a beard, and then afterwards, like, the floodgates were opened for some magnificent facial hair for the next few years. I would say that Rutherford B. Hayes probably had the most impressive one, okay? But then after Taft, they're all clean shaven again. So anyways, there was a brief and shining moment in American history where most presidents had beards, and now it's over. Okay, so you'll probably never see another president with a beard. It's like a weird thing. People just don't want to vote for people with beards.
That's why you're not our mayor.
No, I'm not the mayor. But the mayor,
Does
you know
he
what?
have a beard?
The mayor, he sometimes has a beard. I don't know.
Well, she looks like clean shaven.
Different.
I
Okay,
feel like you
so-
look clean shaven.
as soon as I graduated from high school, I stopped shaving. All right, so Rutherford B. Hayes, he's the president that he was a Republican. His election was, I'm just going to tell you a few quick details and then we're going to move on. Just some fun facts, okay? Rutherford B. Hayes, he was the president that was a Republican, and he ran against a Democrat named Samuel Tilden, and it was so close that it went to some horse trading in Congress, and the Democrats decided to allow Rutherford B. Hayes to be president if he was willing to end Reconstruction. So Rutherford B. Hayes, he had some policies that he wanted to push for, like, helping business out, and he was willing to basically sacrifice the African Americans in the South, going back to segregation and discriminate, or having segregation and discrimination, and he ended Reconstruction so that he could be the president. So there you go. Then we have James Garfield. James Garfield, he became president during the middle of a civil war among Republicans. So the biggest issue, there were two big issues in politics, okay, like the two hot button issues. The first one was tariffs. The second one was civil service reform. If you looked at the political parties, the Republican and the Democratic Party, they really actually weren't that much different during the period of the Gilded Age, okay? Republicans and Democrats were super similar except for one major issue, and that was tariffs, okay? Tariffs are taxes on imported goods. When you raise taxes on imported goods, it encourages people to buy goods from domestic producers, and so it's typically good for factory owners and big business. But tariffs typically are bad for consumers because you have to pay higher prices, right? So Democrats typically wanted lower tariffs, Republicans wanted higher tariffs. And so in general, Republicans tended to be more on the side of big business, and Democrats tended to not be, but there were a lot of big businesses that like Democrats. Don't think that they were like super polar opposites. This was like a narrow issue. But the second issue was civil service reform, okay? Some people wanted to get rid of the patronage system, which we talked about last week. The way that political machines would corrupt city governments is how they would use their political offices to give themselves jobs or to make money on the local scene. And then they would use that money to put more people into political power, and they would just grow in power, okay? Some people wanted to keep patronage around because it was a handy tool for politicians, and like that was the way they made their bread and butter, and they thought it's fair, to the victor go the spoils, like Andrew Jackson said. But some people wanted to reform civil service and make sure that only people who were qualified for government jobs got government jobs, and that way they could reduce wasteful spending and make government more efficient. For the Republican Party, the people that were for keeping patronage around, the old way of doing things, were called the stalwarts or the stalwarts. The Republicans that were more for reforming civil service reform were called the half-breeds, okay, which was an insult, but they kept it. And they're like, yeah, we like being the half-breeds. Anyways, moving on, there was a civil war in the Republican Party, and they couldn't decide who they wanted to be the next president. At the Republican National Convention in 1880, James Garfield, he was a senator, I believe, from Ohio, maybe, somewhere in the Midwest. Anyways, he made this really great speech promoting one particular candidate. And the people, after they heard that speech at the convention, they're like, well, let's just let that guy be president, okay? Forget the person he's trying to get us to vote for. We like him. And so they voted for him. And James Garfield became president. He ran for re-election and he won, and things are going great, okay? And then this guy named Charles Guiteau, told you about him last week, okay? He was nuts. He thought that he was owed a job by James Garfield because he thought he had helped James Garfield win the president. He's actually crazy and deranged. And anyways, he shot the president and killed him. Yes. Oh, yeah, you weren't here for that story.
No.
Okay, so you should have watched the video. But anyways, so Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau was this guy that was a super fan of the Republican Party. But he was also like, he was insane. Like, he was literally insane. He would like go out on the street and like tell people to vote for James Garfield. And like he thought, like, he's like, I hope James Garfield win. Okay. That's like the people that, wave a, like, let's say that you put a Biden sign out in your front yard and then Biden wins the president and you're like, yep, that was me. I'm the one that made that happen. Okay. Like, it's like, that's not how it works. But anyway, that's what Charles Guiteau thought. And so when Charles Guiteau thought he was going to get this job from the government, like he wanted to be like a postmaster at some post office, and he didn't get it, he was so mad and so upset that he shot James Garfield. He shot the president and killed him. Yeah, he died. Dead. D-E-D, dead. Okay? Anyways. D-E-D, dead. That's how dead he was. They didn't even have a name. Okay? Anyway, so then Chester Arthur becomes president. Chester Arthur is notable for having the most impressive sideburns in probably American history, except for Ambrose Burnside. Like, he had a mustache that connected into his sideburns. He left his chin open. Anyway, so Chester Arthur is interesting because when James Garfield was nominated for president, he was a half-breed. And to keep the Republican Party together, they nominated a vice president, Chester Arthur, who was a stalwart, which meant he was actually for patronage and the spoil system. But James Garfield was literally killed by someone acting out of like the spoil system, like I didn't get a job. You were supposed to give me a job because I helped you politically. Now, Charles Guiteau was like insane, but the point is that the spoil system had gone too far. So Chester Arthur, he basically sacrificed his whole political career and got civil service reform passed. He put all his political bargaining chips on the table, and he got something passed called the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, or Civil Service Act, which required people who got government jobs to take a test to prove that they were eligible and worthy of having that job. And all across the country, you start to see some reform in city governments. A lot of cities move away from mayors to city councils, who then hire a city manager. So Sulphur Springs, for example, has a city council, and the city council is elected, but the person who actually does the day-to-day managing of the city is the city manager, who is hired, which means that for him, it's like a job, like managing a business, rather than being like managing the city, rather than being elected and having to make like Republicans or Democrats happy, city managers, they just have to keep the city council happy, and they're able to more effectively do their jobs without getting as much in politics. It's not a perfect system, but some cities start to move to city managers, and there's other ways to move away from that corruption. That in Chester Arthur, that was like his big thing. And it was such a big deal that he kind of alienated some of his old political allies, and he didn't get to run for re-election afterwards. Anyway, or he didn't win re-election. And so the next president is Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland was a Democrat, and he was, he's notable for being the only president to serve non-consecutive terms. So Grover Cleveland was our 22nd president for 4 years. Then he lost to Benjamin Harrison. But as he was leaving office, his wife told the staff, she said, keep everything the way it is, because I want it this way. I want everything to be exactly what it is when we come back in 4 years. Like, don't move the furniture. We'll be back in 4 years. And they did come back. 4 years later, Grover Cleveland won re-election, won election the second time, and he's the 24th president. He's the only one to do that. Okay, so Benjamin Harrison, the only thing, he was a Republican. He was the grandson of William Henry Harrison. Okay. William Henry Harrison, if you remember, he was the first president to die in office. Bottom right was Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison, his grandpa, William Henry Harrison, was the guy, he was the first Whig president, and he ran, and he made this like long speech in the rain, then he drank some bad water, and one thing led another, and he died like a few months into being the president. Okay, so like that was William Henry Harrison. He died like a few months into office. Well, his grandson actually ran for president and served a full term, 4 years. That's Benjamin Harrison. They're the only grandpa-grandson group to be president. Okay, now you feel bad for Benjamin Harrison's dad, because his dad was president and his son was president, but he was not.
Did he run?
I don't know, but that would be something that would be fun to research. Anyways, that's all I'm going to say about them. They're boring, okay?
No, they're not.
They don't do a whole lot.
They probably don't think that.
At the time, they were more important. Now, what's more exciting is the populists, okay? So, you probably noticed that I said that the Republican Democratic parties were basically the same, okay? They didn't really do a whole lot different. And so there were many, and when you see things like that, when you go through periods of time where the political parties seem like they're exactly the same, you start to see the beginnings of third parties. Third parties are political parties that tend to rise up to offer a third option in our politics when you have a two-party system. Third parties usually don't ever win, but what they tend to do is they tend to change the conversation, bring attention to specific issues that are very important to them, and sometimes they are part of what we call realignment or partisan realignment, where the political parties shift and like the groups of people that tend to vote for political parties shift. A lot of times in periods of like political chaos, you have a third party. And in this case, we had a period of stagnation, okay? Big business basically dominated politics. In the big cities on the East Coast and in the North and in the Midwest, they dominated American politics. And so for all these new states in the West, there is a feeling that they are being left out. Remember, we talked about Western settlement. A lot of states are popping up in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and they're becoming new states who have representation in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, but they tend to be left out. Okay, you can look at the statehood years. We got Dakotas, 1889, Wyoming, 1890, Montana, 1889, Idaho, 1890, Washington, 1889, Utah, 1896. Okay, a lot of these, but Colorado became a state in 1876. And so you're seeing a lot of new states pop up. And you see a lot of farmers that feel as though they're politically being left out. Okay, the major Republican Democratic parties, they don't seem to do a whole lot to care for the issues of farmers. And the main political issues of farmers that they deal with are things like railroads, okay? Railroads and monopolies of railroads are very problematic for farmers, okay? When you live in the city of Chicago, there's several different railroad companies to pick from to ship your goods. If one railroad company doesn't offer you a good price, you go to the next one, okay? If you're a factory owner in Chicago, you can get a cheap rate on your railroads. If you're a farmer in Wyoming and there's only one railroad within 100 miles of your farm, you basically have to pay whatever rate that the railroad charges. Okay, so farmers tended to have to deal with extremely high prices and unfair prices for transportation. And if you're a farmer and you're growing thousands of acres of wheat, you've got to sell it in the East to make money to buy things. And so you've got to sell it using the railroad. And so the railroads, in many ways, were literally taking advantage of people, like this political cartoon shows you. They just like running over the people roughshod. But the populist party is the party of the farmers. It's a political party that crops up after a series. There's a lot of different like farmers cooperative movements that pop up during this time period, but the populists are the most important, okay? And so we're not going to go through like the Greenback Party and all those different ones, or the Grange or whatever. We're just going to focus on the populists. But the main issues for farmers is that they have to learn how to work together. Farmers tend to deal with things like isolation, long, hard work, high prices in railroads, but there's other problems they have to deal with as well. The two other problems are debt and overproduction. So if you were going to make a list of farmer problems, okay, farmer problem number one, okay. First off, it's just hard to be a farmer. It's hard work. You're isolated, okay? You're on your own, okay? Farm problem, isolation. What eventually farmers start doing is they form these things called farmers cooperatives, a co-op, where they're still around today. You ever been to the farmers co-op in Sulphur Springs? What they do is they buy things in bulk to help out farmers. If you're by yourself buying, say, corn, okay, you're going to pay more like a retail price. But have you ever noticed how when you buy in bulk, things are cheaper? Like if you buy a single soda at the gas station, it's more expensive than if you buy a 12-pack of sodas, okay? Typically, when you buy in bulk, you save because you make things more efficient. So farmers would start to make co-ops. Farmers would start to make co-ops where they would buy things together, like electricity. Farmers would buy electricity together. There you go. So that they could have electricity at a cheaper rate than if it was just one farmer trying to buy electricity by themselves, okay? So you start to see co-ops, okay? But that's not the only problem. And that problem is easier to solve than some of these other problems, okay? So we talked about railroads. Eventually, farmer co-ops start doing stuff with railroads to negotiate better prices. But railroads are basically monopolies for farmers, okay? Because they don't have a whole lot of options and they charge them really unfair prices. The third problem that farmers face is debt, okay? When you're a farmer, you get paid once a year. When you get paid once a year, you've got to use that money for the rest of the year to pay off all your stuff. And we talked about this with sharecropping, okay? Where you've got to make everything count. And if you have a bad year, let's say it doesn't rain, Let's say a thunderstorm of hail beats down your corn and you lose half your crop. Let's say grasshoppers come in and they eat half your crop. You're still in debt. You still got to pay your debt. And if you can't pay your debt, guess what? Next year you'll have to get in more debt to start over again. And so eventually you get to the point where you might just have your whole farm repossessed and the bank comes in and owns your farm. And then you might end up having to work on your old farm as a laborer for the bank for the farm that you used to own, okay, as a tenant farm. So these are problems. But the last problem is kind of complex and it's called overproduction, okay? Farmers are getting new technology like mechanical harvesters, new fertilizers, better farming techniques, and they're producing more food, which is a good thing because more food means we can feed more people. We don't need as many people to be farmers and we can diversify the economy. But when you make too much food, you create a problem of overproduction. So if you remember, if the supply of a good is high and the demand is low, the price is low. If you increase the supply of goods and the demand for those goods stays relatively the same, then the price is going to continue to decrease. And this is a problem if you're a farmer in debt, okay? Let's imagine that you, Mr. Brown, are a carrot farmer. You're a carrot farmer, and you have a 100-acre farm, and every year, you are able to grow, let's just say 1,000 pounds of carrots, okay? 1,000 pounds of carrots. Every year, you grow 1,000 pounds of carrots. Okay, this is year one. Okay? In that year one, the price per carrot, we're just going to say, is $1 per pound. Let's just make it simple math. Okay, $1 a pound. So you profit $1,000, and your debt for that year, you had to borrow $800. So after you pay off all your stuff, you end up with, well, we'll call that your gross income. So your profit is $200. So every year you borrow $800. Every year you make $1,000. Every year you save about $200. Okay, you do this over and over again, you'll be okay. But the problem is, Mr. Brown, that you are not farming all by yourself. All across the country, there are other carrot farmers, and they are growing carrots more and more and more. And the international price of carrots, because the international supply of carrots is going up, your price of carrots is going down. So next year, and let's just say next year you need, next year the price goes down to, we're going to make it really dramatic, 75 cents. Okay? If you want to make at least $800, okay, you're going to have to grow more carrots. Okay? Let's multiply that. You need $800. Okay? We're going to need 0.75 times, we'll do 0.75. Yeah, I put that wrong. 0.75. No. You're going to need now 1,000 to pay off your debt of $800. At the very least, you have to grow 1,086 pounds of carrots. Okay? And that's just to cover your debt. And so your profit is going to decrease. Okay? But the next year, because you grew more carrots, guess what everyone else did? They grew more carrots. So now the price of the supply of carrots has gone up even higher. And so the price has gotten even lower. So next year, carrots are only 50 cents. Okay? So you're a farmer, Mr. Brown. What's the only thing you know to do to make more money?
Grow more.
Grow more carrots. And you see how this could create a problem, right? Now, I've grossly simplified this. This happened over decades. And it was much I simplified it, okay? I made this much more simple than it actually was. This happened over decades, and it was much more complicated. But in general, farm prices were going down and farm debt was going up. And all across the country, farmers are starting to look at the possibility that they could lose everything. And the Democratic and Republican parties really weren't doing anything to stop it. So various different movements, there's like the Grange, there was like one I think called there's different little political parties that pop up. But the one that really sticks out in history is called the People's Party or the Populist Party. And the Populist Party was a political party geared towards the interest of farmers and manual labor, okay? What they wanted were solutions to problems that they faced. The Populist Party called for things like the government ownership of railroads. They wanted the government to run railroads to make sure that railroads treated all their customers fairly, because they felt that they were discriminated against because they were farmers and not big city factories. The populists also wanted political reforms. They felt that the politicians did not represent them. So they wanted things like secret ballot. Secret ballot would diminish the power of political machines. Remember, we talked about how they would bribe people to vote. If you have secret ballot, it's harder to bribe someone to vote because they can take your money and then vote for whoever they want to when they're in the secret box, right? So secret ballot would diminish the power of political machines. They also wanted things like a direct income tax. Instead of tariffs, which hurt farmers because they have to pay higher prices for goods because of the tariff taxes, they wanted an income tax that would tax people with high incomes instead of hurting farmers, okay? They also wanted things like voter initiative, referendum, and recall. Voter initiative is this idea that voters can introduce legislation to Congress. Voter referendum is when voters get to vote on specific issues instead of just letting Congress do it. And recall is when you can have a recall election to get rid of a politician that is bad. The populists were actually successful in getting some of these things in some parts of the country. We use referendum, for example, in Texas. In Texas, when you try to add an amendment to the Texas state constitution, they have a voter referendum, and the voters vote on that amendment, yes or no. Referendums are used a lot to get things like marijuana legal. They did that in like California and Colorado. They like put it on the ballot and let the people vote on it instead of just letting Congress decide. Voter initiative, you'll see that every now and then. Voter recall, for example, right now there's like an effort to recall the governor of California, Gavin Newsom. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but there's like people trying to do that. You can recall elections and or elected officials in some states, not so much at the national level. Anyways, but the biggest thing the populists wanted, more than anything else, was the free coinage of silver. You see, our money today is not based off of anything other than the strength of the federal government. Your money is worth money because you believe it is worth money, okay? But back during the Gilded Age, money in America was based off of gold. For every dollar bill in someone's hand, there was an equivalent amount of gold in the treasury, okay? And the dollars were basically representing the gold in the banks. And in fact, that kind of happens sometimes today. Like for example, like the Federal Reserve Bank in New York, there's just these big old vaults full of gold and like big accounts. I'm talking like government accounts, like the Spain's gold or whatever is like in those banks. And sometimes when like say Spain wants to make a payment to France or whatever, they just go down into like the gold vault and they take like a brick of gold from one and they put it in the other, okay? But that's like big money stuff, okay? For us, normal dollar bill people, okay, it's just a piece of paper, but it represents something else. And during the Gilded Age, it represented gold. But when you have only gold backing up your money, that means that you can only have so much money. You can't just print off more money. And what the populists wanted was to add silver to the money supply and effectively double the amount of money that we have. And that would create something called inflation. Inflation is when the value of money decreases, okay? Like you notice things get more expensive every year. just everything, that's inflation. It's not because things are getting more expensive. It's because your money is getting cheaper, okay? Money works the same way as supply and demand. When you have more and more supply of money, the price of money goes down. And when you reduce the supply of money, the price goes up, okay? The price of money or the power of money. Most of the time, inflation is bad, okay? If you have $5,000 in the bank and there's a 1% inflation rate every year, that means that next year you only have really $4,900 or $4,500, whatever, $4,900 if we do 1%. Yeah. The way it works is like, say there's a 1% inflation rate. You have $1 this year. Next year, that same dollar is only worth 99 cents of year $1. Does that make sense? It's still $1, but it can only buy, like if you measure it in like potato chips, okay? You can buy 1 bag of potato chips for $1. You know, in 5 years, you'll need $1 and a nickel to buy that same bag of potato chips. That's inflation. Most of the time, that's a bad thing because your money is literally losing value. Can anyone guess when is the one situation, what's a situation where inflation is good? When is it a good thing if money loses its value? For who would it be a good thing? Because it's a good thing for some people.
Stock market.
Sometimes for the stock market, but it's good for farmers. So what do farmers have in this list that has something to do with inflation? Can we figure this out? This is tough. It's tough.
Oh, debt.
Debt, exactly. If you owe $1,000 and next year the price of money drops by half, now you really only owe $500. And when you have more money, it's easier to get loans. There's more credit available, and it's easier to get by without losing your farm. So populists wanted to add silver to the money supply to devalue money, to reduce their debt and to make it easier for them to get credit. And so the Populist Party actually has some success. They get a few senators, they have some people run for president in the 1880s and 1890s, and they actually get some votes. Now, they don't have enough votes to like win on their own. So what happens to the Populist Party is the same thing that happens to most third parties. Once a third party starts to get popular, the two big parties start to pay attention. And one way or another, they're going to try to absorb them in their votes. And the Democratic Party does that. In 1896, the Democratic Party nominates this guy named William Jennings Bryan to run for president. William Jennings Bryan is a populist and a Democrat. So he brings together the Populist Party into the Democratic Party. And so he combines their forces. And William Jennings Bryan goes on a whirlwind election tour across the country, making speech after speech after speech about populist issues. And his big #1 issue is the free coinage of silver. He makes this famous speech, okay, where he's called the Cross of Gold speech. That's why he's holding a cross made of gold. And he basically is issuing a warning to like big business. He's like, you will not press this crown of thorns upon our head. You will not cross it. You will not crucify America upon a cross of gold. He like makes this big fiery speech and people like love it. And he's basically calling out big business because for big business, they don't want the free coinage of silver because then all their big stacks of money in their bank are going to become less valuable. Okay. So William Jennings Bryan takes on the big Wall Street businesses. Okay. He's kind of like a mini Bernie Sanders or whatever, but a little different, but kind of like that. He wants the government to take ownership of railroads. He wants more of a kind of like socialism, but they don't call it socialism as much. Anyway, he wants this, and he goes around the country. He makes speech after speech. He does these things called whistle stop speeches, where he gets in like the back of a train. They go to a town where like they load up people on the train. He gets out, and he makes a speech for like 10, 15 minutes, and he goes. He goes all across the country. His opponent, President William McKinley, hangs out. And how home, he writes letters, he gets people to campaign upon his behalf. Now, just off of that, who do you think is going to win?
Bernie Sanders.
You think like the effort would matter, but actually no. William McKinley wins. Okay? William McKinley, he defeats William Jennings Bryan. This is like this is a whistle stop speech where you like stop and then you make a speech or whatever. William McKinley, he basically says that he is going to bring prosperity at home and prestige abroad. Okay, let me move this. Prosperity at home, prestige abroad. William McKinley, he is the president for commerce and civilization. He's more of an imperialist president, and he wins. There's different theories about why he wins. Some people say he wins because of political machines, but I think it's an interesting difference in that this election is basically the country versus the city, and the city wins. You see, farmers want their debt reduced, so they want cash to be worth less. William McKinley wants to keep the dollar strong, and he wins the big cities. And there's more people in the city than in the country. Remember, we talked about that. The country has changed. We're not a country of farmers anymore. We're a country of cities. And in 1896, the farmers lose because factory workers, in my opinion, this is my theory, factory workers, they get paid in cash. So if money becomes less valuable, then their cash that they get paid as a factory worker is worth less. So it is not in the interest of factory workers necessarily to vote for William Jennings Bryan. And so William Jennings Bryan gets beaten. He tries and tries and tries. He runs for president like 3 or 4 times every time he loses, okay? But William McKinley wins, and he keeps the big business direction of American government, and he continues the policies of laissez-faire in the Gilded Age. But don't cry, the populists will come back, sort of. A later political party called the Progressive Party will basically do everything the populists want. Almost everything the populists wanted, except for like government ownership of railroads, we have today. Like just about everything they want, we have today. We don't even have silver or gold backing up our money anymore. It's just like however much money we want to have. The Federal Reserve decides that. So anyways, they get what they want eventually, but this is not their day in the sun. This is the day of William McKinley, who's another president gets shot, okay? But this a little bit later. But we had like 2 presidents get shot in this chapter, so that's something. All right, yes, so here's the election. William McKinley wins 61% of the electoral vote, 51% of the popular vote, and you note that he wins the big cities in the north and the east, in the Midwest. This is where all the factories are. Jennings Bryan, he wins the South because he's a Democrat, and the South is going to vote for Democrat until the 1960s because they're still upset about the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln's the party, his party's Republicans. They don't like Abraham Lincoln, so the South votes for Democrats. So he gets the South and the West, and then the North and the East, they vote for the cities. They vote for William McKinley. So the farmers lose. So go tell your farm teacher how in 1896 the city beat them. All right, and then tomorrow let's learn about imperialism, okay? Y'all have a good day. Do good things, be good people, make